Sure, sure. Welcome, everyone. My name is Samson Williams here with the Crowdfunding Professionals Association, and today with Devin Thorpes and Jenny Kassan. And Jenny is actually going to drop some knowledge on us for changes to the crowdfunding regulations that she's looking at and proposing. It's really exciting times, particularly given the pandemic issues that we're facing. How can small businesses, Main Street America, be resilient? And more importantly, how can Congress and our legislators help us be resilient, help those Main Street be resilient. I'm going to just give you a little bit about Jenny based upon her awesomeness. She has over 2 years, 2 years. Haha, sorry, Jenny. I took those other 18 decades of experience you have away as being an attorney advisor. She's helped her clients raise millions of dollars from values aligned investors. So we'll ask her later what a value aligned investor is. And she's personally raised over $1.5 million for her own business. So Jenny, without any further ado, talk us through, introduce yourself. If I've missed anything. How are we, what changes are we looking at to crowdfunding as we try to get back to a new normal?
Yes, thank you. I'm excited to share. It's some really good news. And I'll just let you know that I've been a securities lawyer for almost 15 years. And I started helping my clients raise money in creative ways way back when. And then in 2012, we got some improvements to the laws that govern how we're allowed to raise money. The securities laws do regulate how we're allowed to ask for investment. A lot of entrepreneurs and business owners don't even know that there's a lot of regulations on how you're allowed to ask for an investment. So if you put up on your website, hey, if you want to invest in my business, send me an email, you're probably breaking the law. So I've been working for a while on trying to make the laws a little bit more user-friendly. And when in 2012, the Jobs Act was passed, which added some new tools to the toolbox. And I was involved in that, in getting that law passed. So we've been sort of watching the results of that. And some really good things have happened, but there's also always room for improvement. So about a couple weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the federal agency that regulates the federal securities rules, came out with some new proposed rules that will improve some of the challenges that we've been facing under both the Jobs Act and also the laws that were in place before the Jobs Act. And they're just proposed rules right now, but there's some really exciting things in there. And we expect it to go into effect, these changes to go into effect as soon as May or June. We're in a comment period right now. So the Crowdfunding Professional Association is working on a letter to the SEC with our comments. And if anyone has input, we'd love to hear that from you so that we can be sure and share the best possible input on these proposed rules. So I'm going to go through really quickly what the rules are proposing. And, Samson can feel free to ask questions. I think people who are on the call can also chat in some questions. So I'll just get started, and then Samson, feel free to chime in if you have questions or if you see any questions from people on the call.
Will do.
Okay, so number one is a pretty technical issue that we call integration. And this has to do with the law governing when you're raising money, you use two different rules to raise money from investors. There are some rules to make sure that you don't game the system by raising money in one way and then switching over to another way in a way that allows you to basically evade the rules. So they say the current rule is that if you raise money in one way and then switch to another way, they're going to treat it as if it's really all one way. So that those raises have to together comply with a single rule. And right now, the safe harbor to avoid two different types of raises being treated as one raise is 6 months, separating them by 6 months. So I've often had to tell my clients, hey, you're raising money this way right now, and you want to raise money this other way, you have to be quiet for 6 months and not talk to any investors for 6 months.
Mhm.
So
Hey,
the new
Jenny.
rules are actually going to make that a little bit easier. There's going to be a safe harbor now of just 30 days. And I was thinking, should I give an example of how that could work?
Yeah, Jenny, I have a question for you. Hopefully you can hear me. Um, so when we're talking about integration, so typically when I say crowdfunding and I'm telling people, if you use the internet to ask strangers for money, you're crowdfunding. You might be doing donations, rewards, equity, or debt. So when we're talking about integration, can you give the audience some understanding? Because we know that in Reg CF, the government is very creative. They just call Reg CF regulated crowdfunding. You can raise up to 1,070,000. So when you're saying that now you have to wait 6 months, does that mean you have to wait another 6 months before you can do like a Reg A or a Reg D, or can you run those simultaneously? Could you give us some color around that?
Yeah, so the current rules are pretty complicated because the general rule is the 6 month separation, but we also do have some exemptions from that. So under current law, regulation crowdfunding is not integrated with other offerings. So that's a great thing. So that means that under current law, you can be raising privately, talking to investors, asking for investment right up until the day that you launch your investment crowdfunding campaign. So that's a really good thing. But the proposed rules are going to make it easier to prevent integration, to avoid integration in more cases. So I'll just give a really quick example. So when you're raising money from investors, you have to choose an exemption that you're raising under, an exemption from the registration requirement. So a lot of my clients will use Rule 504. And Rule 504 is nice because it actually allows you to include both accredited and unaccredited investors, wealthy and non-wealthy investors. But then maybe they want to switch over to something called Rule 506C. And the nice thing about Rule 506C is it actually allows public advertising. But Rule 506C does not allow you to include unaccredited, i.e. non-wealthy investors. So up until these rules change, if my clients were raising under Rule 504, I had to tell them you have to wait 6 months before you launch a Rule 506C offering. But that will not be the case anymore if these new rules go into effect. You'll only have to wait 30 days, or maybe you may not even need to wait at all. The only thing is you need to make sure that, actually, no, in that case, you're totally fine. You won't have to wait 6 months. So anyway, I could go into a lot more complexity about it, but I think I'll leave it at that because we could have like a two-hour seminar on integration alone, and there's so many more rules.
Yes, that's actually very helpful to know that, because partially from a business perspective, a startup perspective, if you've built this groundswell and this buzz and this awareness, you want to be able to seize upon that and not have to go and basically go to a timeout for half a year. So thank you for
Exactly. Yeah,
providing
it's
clarity.
really tough to not be able to raise any money for 6 months and when you probably are needing to raise money yesterday. So, okay, number two, this is a rule regarding demo days. Oh, and one thing I just want to say really quickly, these rules do not generally affect state law. These are federal rules that are being proposed. So even though you may have a great new possibility under these new rules under federal law, you still have to check the laws of the state that you're in. So the demo days is a great example of that, where this new federal rule is going to make things a lot easier, but you still have to check and make sure that your state law is going to help you out as well. So basically, right now, if you a lot of entrepreneurs go to events where they're asked to talk about their business and basically say, hey, I'm raising money, these are called demo days, pitch events, etc. And a lot of entrepreneurs don't realize that when they're doing that, they are very likely breaking the law because they're publicly advertising the fact that they're raising money. And to be able to do that, there's some very specific requirements that have to be met first. So unfortunately, a lot of these folks that organize these events may not realize that by having you speak at that event, that they're actually causing you to be breaking the law. So this new rule will create an exemption that if a demo day is organized by a college, university, or other institution of higher education, local government, nonprofit, or angel investor group, incubator, or accelerator, if you publicly announce the fact that you're raising money at this event, you will not be considered to be doing a public solicitation of your investment offering. There are some other requirements. For example, the organizer of the event cannot charge fees for the event beyond reasonable administrative costs. No one can recommend any investments at the event. There have to be some disclosures made. There's some limitations on what you can say, but and again, this might not help you at all because of state law. But if you are raising money under an exemption that has preemption of state rules, which some rules do have, then you don't have to worry about the state rules. Oh, you're muted, Samson.
So I have a highly technical question for you.
Okay.
Do these rules apply to Zoom conferences or Zoom demos?
Sure, absolutely. As long as it, as you meet those requirements and the event is hosted by one of those types of entities that I mentioned.
Okay, good to know.
All right, next one, testing the waters. So this one's kind of exciting. So, and I'll use crowdfunding as an example of this because this can apply in other situations too, but I'll just use crowdfunding as an example. So under current law, if you're raising money under Regulation Crowdfunding, you are not allowed to tell anyone that you're raising money under Regulation Crowdfunding until you filed your Form C, which is a very extensive process to do. There's a lot of required disclosures. You have to get a certain type of financials completed. And so you might spend a fair amount of money getting ready to launch under Regulation Crowdfunding and not be able to even tell anyone that you're doing it. And so the scary thing about that is that you might launch and realize like, oh my gosh, we really didn't design this the right way. We should have, done some market testing first. We should have talked to our potential investors first about the best way to, structure our offering. And so under this new rule, you will now be able to do that. You will be able to, quote unquote, test the waters, which means before you do any compliance for Regulation Crowdfunding, you'll be able to talk to people, tell them that you're planning to raise money under Regulation Crowdfunding. There's some disclosures you'll have to make sure they understand you're not currently offering an investment opportunity or even accepting commitments. And this testing the waters rule is actually, you can do it even if you don't end up doing Regulation Crowdfunding, even if you use a different rule. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be really helpful.
I have a question for you. Suppose we were going to launch in April of 2020, but because of current pandemic issues, we now have to delay our launch till April of 2021. Can we test the waters now by saying that, hey, we're going to come back and use this platform in 2021?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no time limit from what I can see. You can today start telling people, hey, I'm thinking I'm going to probably do some crowdfunding under Regulation Crowdfunding. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. Let's see there's some, you just have to make sure that you put legends on any materials that you distribute that say that you're not currently accepting any investments, that any indication of interest is non-binding. There's a few rules that you would have to comply with, but other than that, it's pretty open, which is awesome. You can even, publicly, if you're pretty sure you will end up using investment crowdfunding, which does allow public solicitation, then your testing the waters communications can also be public. You could put it up on your website. You can speak about it at events. So it's pretty cool. Although don't forget, none of these rules are in effect yet. So we want to remember that. We want to wait till they actually go into effect.
Yes. And they're going into effect, you said, in May or so?
We're hoping May or June.
Okay.
But we won't know for sure. You know, for all we know, this pandemic situation could slow things down. We don't know. So stay tuned. You can check on the Securities and Exchange Commission website to get updates. You know, you can keep checking back. All right, next one. Very, very minor issue, but under regulation crowdfunding, there's some limitations on what you're allowed to say when you are raising money under regulation crowdfunding. And I hope that we actually get the SEC to look at some of the rules about communications during a regulation crowdfunding offering. They haven't currently proposed anything very helpful under that, but they do just, it's a very technical thing, but they just clarify that you can make both oral and written communications when you're doing regulation crowdfunding. So that's super minor.
So do those oral and written communications include Twitter, Instagrams, and the social media?
Absolutely, yes. There's really no limit on how you can communicate during regulation crowdfunding, but there are limits on what you can say, which are pretty complicated rules, and we hope that we're hoping they will consider improving those. So just as an example, like if I'm making a presentation about my regulation crowdfunding offering, let's say I've already filed all my disclosures, I filed my Form C, I'm up on a platform, I'm at an event talking about my company and how great my company is and the fact that I'm raising money under regulation crowdfunding. I'm not allowed to say how much I'm raising. I'm not allowed to say when the campaign closes. I'm not allowed to say what I'm offering, like equity, debt, etc. So it's very challenging to comply with those rules because it comes so naturally to want to talk about that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So we're hoping they might consider making some changes there, but that is not part of the proposal right now.
Hey, Jenny, we have a question that I probably should have seen a couple of moments ago. It says, how does the 12-month limitation work for this is Cody, by the way, he's asking this question. How does the 12-month limitation work for unaccredited investors if they invest a maximum of $2,200 over 6 months? When does the 12-month period start and end for this type of allocation?
It sounds like I wonder if they're talking about, if they're relating this back to the integration rules, that is an unrelated issue to the integration rules. So the caps on how much you can invest under regulation crowdfunding apply per year, regardless of whether you invest in one offering or 20 offerings. So yeah, that is not being proposed to be changed right now, although I think we may submit a comment asking for some changes there. There is a proposed change to the per investor caps, which I'll be talking about in a minute.
Mm-hmm. So just for clarity, the integration part is for issuers or founders or startups, whereas the investment over that 12-month period, that's for investors.
Exactly. They're totally unrelated issues.
Okay. And one more question that Stefan has. What determines whether an investor is accredited or unaccredited?
So there's a federal rule that defines an accredited investor. So people can be accredited and not even know they're accredited. You either are or you aren't. And it's that for an individual, it's $200,000 in annual income or more, or $300,000 with a spouse, or $1 million in net worth, not including your primary residence. That's the basic definition of whether you're accredited or not.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we're going to move on. And I am covering some of the more arcane ones just because I want to be complete. So this one's a little, not arcane, but kind of not that helpful. So under Rule 506C, which allows public advertising but does require that all of your investors are accredited, The proposed rule says that if you raise money from somebody under Rule 506C and determine that they are accredited, and then you raise money from them again, you don't have to redo the verification process. You can kind of assume that they are accredited. So that's a pretty minor issue. Okay, the next one is has to do with Rule 506B. So Rule 506B is the rule that people who are raising money kind of using the venture capital model where you go to accredited investors only and you ultimately are heading towards raising money from VCs, kind of that sort of well-known path that's been happening for decades, the Silicon Valley style of raising money. Most people who raise money that way are going to be raising under Rule 506B. And 506B it's the classic way to raise money. You basically, it's a private offering. You do not publicly advertise it. There's no cap on how much you can raise. And there is this part of the federal law that says you can actually have up to 35 unaccredited investors, but they have to be sophisticated. And if you do have any unaccredited investors under 506B, you have to provide them some extra disclosures. So those disclosures have been quite onerous, and for that reason, almost nobody ever includes unaccredited investors in a 506B offering, because the minute you include just one, you have to have audited financials and extra disclosures. So the proposed rule says that if you're raising up to 20 million, you'll no longer have to do audited financials for unaccredited investors. I don't think that's a really big deal, because usually if you're doing a 506B, you're probably not going to end up including unaccredited investors anyway, but if you do want to, it should make it a little bit easier. Okay, under Rule 504, there's a proposal to increase the maximum you can raise to 10 million. That it's currently 5 million. And as I mentioned before, under Rule 504, you can include both accredited and unaccredited investors without all those extra requirements that I was just talking about under 506B. So that's great that you'll be able to raise up to 10 million under Rule 504. Now, Rule 504 does not preempt state law, so there could be state level limitations. Like, for example, I happen to know in Washington state, even though Rule 504 currently allows you to raise up to 5 million, in Washington state, there's a cap of 1 million for those types of raises. So it doesn't always help, but in most states, that'll probably be helpful.
So Jenny, as we're coming up on our 5-minute warning, I just want to do a quick recap. So far, we've talked about integration meaning we're looking at changing the proposals from all these rules will take place. First off, that caveat, all these rules will take place in May or June, hopefully, of this year. And so for integration, we're looking, instead of having to wait 6 months, you might only have to wait 3 months or less to
1 month.
1 month. I'm sorry, 1 month to continue to raise funding for your businesses. If you choose an exemption, we're looking at for Rule 504, moving from $5 million to $10 million that you can raise potentially. And also for 506, looking at how we're looking for public advertising for unaccredited investors and having them part of that deal. So just keep in mind, there's lots of little nuances. Jenny's only been giving you just a little bit.
Yeah.
She's got
and I just have 4 more ones that I'll share. They're fairly simple.
Okay, shoot.
So maximum raise under regulation crowdfunding. These are some exciting changes. So first of all, there is part of the proposal is to increase the amount you can raise under regulation crowdfunding to 5 million. It was right now it's 1.07, but that it's proposed to increase to 5 million. That's super exciting. And also under the current law, there are per investor caps, and the per investor caps are calculated based on the lesser of your net worth or your annual income. And so you could be super wealthy but not have a super high annual income, or you could have a super high annual income but a low net worth, and you'd be very limited in what you could invest under regulation crowdfunding. They're proposing to switch that to the greater of. So that'll be really helpful. Also, super exciting is that right now those caps apply whether you're an unaccredited or accredited investor. They're proposing to remove the caps for accredited investors. That's going to be really, really helpful, because we have had clients who are raising money under regulation crowdfunding, had accredited investors go on to the platform and not be able to invest as much as they had wanted to invest because of those caps. I can share a little bit more about the caps if we have time at the end, but if you go to my website, jennykassan.com, there's a lot more info about all the details on that. Let's see, just two more. There is a proposal to allow, under regulation crowdfunding, if you want to not have a whole bunch of equity investors investing directly in your company. So if you raise money in the form of equity on regulation crowdfunding, you could end up with like 100 or 200 equity investors in your company. And some people find that quite messy to manage. So there's a proposal to allow a special purpose vehicle called a crowdfunding vehicle, where this is currently not allowed. You cannot have like a special purpose vehicle where all your investors go into that vehicle and then the vehicle becomes the sole shareholder in your company. But there is a proposal that would authorize this special type of vehicle that everyone could invest in, and then you just have one equity investor in the company. And then just one last quick one. They are proposing to not allow companies to offer safes under regulation crowdfunding. And a safe is a simple agreement for future equity. It's a fairly new type of security that was invented by Y Combinator. And it's kind of a contract that provides the opportunity to possibly someday in the future get equity in a company, but it is so speculative as to what you may ultimately get that I think the SEC feels that it's not an appropriate instrument for the public. It's good for a more sophisticated like VC style investor, but probably not so much for a less sophisticated investor that would be on regulation crowdfunding. So those are all of them.
Excellent. So safes aren't applicable in the ICO, STO world. They have this thing called a SAFT that is also not a good vehicle, in my opinion. We'll talk about that on another time. But Jenny, one last question before we wrap up. Cody was saying he's asking about the investment limitation for investors. For example, if I invest $1,100 in September, then $1,100 in November, when does a 12-month limitation start, in September or November?
Oh, that's a really good question. I have a feeling, I would have to look at the rules, but I have a feeling it's in any 12-month period. So you cannot have any 12-month period in which you've invested more than your cap.
So it's up to you to keep a track of, hey, in September I invested $1,100. Basically, that starts your clock running until August of next year. But that's a great question, Cody. We'll get some clarity, and thanks for tuning in. And if you guys have any additional question, I dropped jennykassan.com. I dropped her website, her domain name there in the chat, so you can check out some of her more specific questions. And I think that's it for the moment, Jenny. I really appreciate you taking out the time to drop your knowledge. And for those of you who aren't yet members of the Crowdfunding Professional Associations, you can visit CfPA.org and sign up for membership, because we're going to be increasing the number of these webinars as well as educational outreach that we do to keep members engaged, because we're here to help Main Street Americans and businesses and entrepreneurs be awesome. So thanks again for joining us. Devin, thanks again. Jenny, see you guys later.
Sure, yeah, and if you have specific questions like Steven, I wasn't really able to answer your question on caps because it's a little complicated. Feel free to ping me via my website or LinkedIn, and I can answer it.
Awesome. We're out.
All right. Thanks, everyone.